End quote. Put the gun down, sir. Step away from the drone. End quote. That's what the deputy shouted at me, standing right there at the edge of my porch while the acrid smoke from my 12-gauge still hung heavy in the mountain air. And for a second, I just stood there, staring at the heap of twisted plastic and shattered glass lying 20 feet out in the pine needles. Its rotors bent like broken wings, and its camera lens cracked open like a blinded eye. The silence that followed wasn't an oppose. The peaceful kind I'd spent my life savings to buy. It was stunned, the kind of silence you can almost taste, mixed with the smell of gunpowder and the chill of the Colorado morning. And as I lowered my Remington slowly, feeling the barrel still warm against my palm, I looked that deputy straight in the eye and told him, end quote, "Correction, son, I didn't oppose. Just shoot a drone. I shot a felony," end quote. And he just stood there, hand hovering near his sidearm, looking like he wasn't in oppose. Sure whether he was supposed to arrest me or ask for my autograph. My name is Silas Thorne, and at 62, I thought I'd seen every flavor of human ugliness during my 30 years as a field investigator for the Department of Justice, which is exactly why I'd retired to a 100-acre patch of dirt tucked against the jagged spine of the San Juan Mountains, a place where the only neighbors I had to worry about were the elk and the occasional curious bear. I wanted the kind of silence that presses against your ribs, the kind that lets you hear your own heartbeat, far away from the hum of air conditioners and the even louder hum of people telling you how to live your life. But as it turns out, peace in this country is a commodity that some folks think they have a right to steal. It started about 6 months ago with a faint, mechanical buzzing, a sound so out of place in the wilderness that it felt like a needle scratching across a record. And at first, I figured it was just some tourist from Denver testing out a new toy, but when that, end quote, toy, end quote, started showing up every morning at 5:15 a.m., hovering right outside my bedroom window with a gimbal-mounted lens tracking my every move, I knew this wasn't oppose, a hobby. It was a hunt. Now, you have to understand the geography of my situation to see why this got so personal, because my land sits right on the edge of a high-end development called, end quote, the Gables at Black Ridge, end quote, one of those gated communities where the houses all look like different versions of the same beige nightmare, and the grass is measured with a ruler. But the thing is, my property was carved out of the original ranch long before their HOA even existed, meaning I was legally an island, untouchable, and sovereign. But power is a funny thing, especially in the hands of someone like Margaret Vance, the, end quote, Queen Bee, end quote, of the Gables HOA, a woman who looked like she'd been preserved in vinegar and pearls, and who seemingly spent her entire existence obsessing over the, end quote, visual integrity, end quote, of the horizon. And Margaret didn't oppose. Like my, end quote, island, end quote. She didn't oppose. Like my weather barn. She didn't oppose. Like my gravel driveway. And she especially didn't oppose. Like that she couldn't oppose. Tell me what to do. The letters started arriving shortly after the drone sightings began. Thick, expensive envelopes with a gold emboss seal that looked more like a royal decree than a neighborhood notice, claiming that my property was in, end quote, gross violation, end quote, of the community's aesthetic standards, and demanding I pave my road and repaint my house a color they called, end quote, desert whisper, end quote. I laughed the first time I read it. I actually sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon and laughed until my sides ached, because I don and oppose. Belong to their club, I don't pay their dues, and I sure as hell don't take orders from a committee of bored retirees who think they own the sunset. I called the county clerk just to be sure, and the lady on the phone laughed too, telling me, end quote, "Mr. Thorne, you and oppose. Is independent as a sovereign state. They have zero jurisdiction over you," end quote. So I pinned that letter to my mudroom wall and figured that was that. But I'd forgotten one thing from my days in the DOJ. When people like Margaret Vance can oppose, use the law to break you, they'll just make up their own version of the law. The surveillance didn't oppose. Stop. It escalated. And I'm talking about a sophisticated, tactical-grade drone. Not something you buy at a mall, but a sleek, matte black unit with night vision and thermal imaging that started mapping my property line with the precision of a military recon mission. I began to feel a familiar itch under my skin, that old investigator's instinct that tells you when the shadow behind you is moving with intent. So I decided to play their game, but I'd play it by my rules, starting with a series of trail cameras I hidden in the timber all angled to catch the, predator, in the act. One night, around 2 a.m., I stepped out onto my deck and didn't into oppos. Turned on the lights. I just sat there in the dark with a pair of thermal goggles I'd kept from my working days, and sure enough, I saw it. A tiny heat signature hovering 100 feet above my garden. Its lens zoomed in on my back door, and that was the moment I realized this wasn't oppos. Just about visual standards, this was an invasion. A few days later, a white SUV with the Gable security, decal rolled up my drive, and out stepped a guy named Miller, a former mall cop who wore his tactical vest 2 sizes too small and carried a clipboard like it was a shield, and he had this smug, rehearsed smile that made me want to check my pockets for my wallet. Mr. Thorne, he said, puffing out his chest, we in oppos. Regis here to conduct a mandatory boundary audit on behalf of the HOA. We've had reports of environmental hazards on your side of the fence, and I just leaned against the porch railing, looking down at him, and said, Miller, you got about 30 seconds to get that rolling eyesore off my property before I consider this a home invasion. And trust me, I'm much better at paperwork than you are. He turned, red, stammering about, community safety protocols, aerial data discrepancies, but he left, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a feeling that the trap was being set. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted, a reason to overreach. In my old workshop, I spent a weekend putting together a, honeypot, I took a genuine county survey map and used some high-end editing software to create a fake, discrepancy, zone, a narrow strip of land that looked like it legally belonged to the HOA if you didn't in oppos. Looked too close, and on the corner of that map, I printed a tiny, microscopic watermark in ultraviolet ink that read, Bait for Thieves, private property of Silas Thorne. I left that map spread out on my work table, right under the skylight where I knew there, I in the sky, would be looking, and I even went as far as to set up a fake, hazard, area using some old rusted barrels and orange tape, making it look like I was hiding something big. It took exactly 48 hours for them to take the bait, and when the next letter arrived, it wasn't in oppos. A suggestion, it was notice of imminent seizure and fine, claiming that based on, independent geospatial evidence, I was encroaching on community land and harboring toxic waste, and they'd even included a screenshot of my work table, a grainy image taken from a drone that showed my fake map. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction settle in my chest, the kind you get when you see a predator step squarely into a snare, because now I had physical proof of illegal aerial surveillance and digital trespass, but I needed to wait for the final move. I needed them to commit the crime in person. That brings us back to that morning on the porch. The morning I saw the drone coming in lower than ever, almost taunting me, dipping its nose toward my windows like it was searching for more, evidence, and I knew that if I didn't in oppos, in it right then, they'd keep pushing until they found a way to take my home. I didn't in oppos, hesitate. I grabbed the Remington, stepped out into the light, and as the drone rotated to face me, its red recording light blinking like a mocking heartbeat, I squared my shoulders and pulled the trigger, and the roar of that shotgun was the sweetest sound I'd heard in months, a loud, violent declaration of independence. The deputy who showed up, a young guy named Holloway who I actually liked, was caught between a rock and a hard place because Margaret Vance had called it in as active gunfire toward residents, But when I handed him a thumb drive containing 6 months of flight logs, thermal footage of their drone hovering over my bedroom, and the security reports Miller had filed, his face went from suspicious to pale. They've been tracking your vehicle too, Silas? He asked, pointing to a small, magnet-mounted GPS unit I'd found under my bumper that morning, a little black box that tied directly back to a shell company funded by the HOA's, Land Preservation Fund. I just nodded and said, Holloway, I'm an old dog, but I still know how to spot a tail. Now are you going to take my statement? Or do I need to call the Attorney General and tell them you're an accessory to a stalking ring? The fallout was like a dam breaking, and once the local news got a whiff of the drone wars of Black Ridge, the The story exploded because it turned out I wasn't into oppos. The only one Margaret was targeting. She'd been using a private surveillance firm called OmniView to gather dirt on any resident who dared to disagree with her, creating, in quote, dossiers, in quote, of private information to use as leverage during HOA board meetings. We went to court 3 months later, and walking into that courtroom felt like the final act of a long, gritty noir film, with Margaret sitting at the plaintiff and oppos, table looking like her world was made of glass, and someone had just thrown a brick through it. My lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Elena who lived for cases like this, didn't in oppos to even have to raise her voice. She just projected that drone footage on a 20-foot screen. The infrared shots of me in my own home, the close-ups of my private documents, the GPS data showing they'd followed me to my doctor's appointments. And you could feel the air leave the room. When the judge, a no-nonsense veteran named Miller who had zero patience for, in quote, neighborhood Karens, end quote, saw the UV watermark on the map they tried to use as evidence, he actually stopped the proceedings, looked at Margaret, and asked, end quote, mind oppos, do you understand that you have just submitted a confession into the record, end quote. The verdict was a total wipeout for them. The HOA was ordered to pay $750,000 in damages for invasion of privacy, stalking, and civil rights violations, and the OmniView firm had its license revoked faster than you can blink. But the real victory was seeing Margaret Vance being led out of the building in handcuffs after the DA decided to file criminal charges for wiretapping and forgery. As for me, I went back to my mountain. I took that $750,000 and set up a legal defense fund for other rural landowners being bullied by these corporate-style HOAs. And I bought myself a new sign for the front gate. It's made of heavy iron, and it just says, no drones, no bullshit, no exceptions. I sit on my porch every night now, and the silence is back. The real kind, the kind that lets you hear the wind moving through the pines a mile away. And sometimes I look at that shattered drone casing I kept and mounted on my workshop wall like a trophy, and I think about how close I came to letting them win. But that's the thing about people who think they can use technology to play God. They always forget that out here in the dirt and the stone, the old rules still apply, and a man's home, ISN and oppos. Just his castle. It's his fortress. But here's the question I want to leave you with. In an age where everyone has a camera in their pocket and a drone in their trunk, is privacy even a thing anymore? Or have we just accepted that we're all being watched by someone who thinks they know better than us? Did I go too far by pulling that trigger? Or was I just doing what any of you would do if someone was peeking through your curtains with a remote-controlled robot? I want to hear your stories. Have you ever had an HOA try to pull a stunt like this? Or have you found something even weirder under your car bumper? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about where we draw the line between, in quote, community standards, in quote, and in quote, criminal surveillance, in quote. And if you think I was right to defend my dirt the way I did, hit that like button and share this with anyone who values their peace and quiet as much as I do. Stay safe, stay private, and keep your eyes on the sky.